A bit about the talk. So really about benchmarking endpoint detection and response systems and managed detection and response solutions. So the challenge is, which MDR should we go with? There's a lot of clients and a lot of organizations which are pondering over this question. There's a lot of organizations who are looking to change or are looking to adopt EDR solutions or MDR solutions and potentially don't know where to go, what to look at. There are some good benchmarking and third-party benchmarking solutions out there, which I'll touch on in a moment. But some of the challenge around that is, how do you choose the right one? You know, is the market potentially skewed by organizations claiming to have 100% efficacy of TTPs that MITRE has, etc.? So really, yeah, I just want to dig into a bit of that, and potentially I'll take you through a little bit later how Jumpsec has validated an EDR and MDR solution, and how the results potentially differ to that of, let's say, MITRE, for example, from evaluation perspective. And one of the challenges that was quite prevalent in the industry and across the buyers community was that what you were seeing from the vendors' scores were that everybody was getting 100%. And one of the challenges with that, and should be quite obvious, is how do you then pick a vendor if everybody's got 100% efficacy on a certain TTP group, etc. Which one is the best? And that's a real challenge. The same thing happened back in 2020 when everybody was getting sort of AA ratings as they had it back then. So yeah, I touched a little bit on MITRE bingo. Basically, you know, I see a lot of organizations who map their SOC capabilities by just ticking off pieces on the MITRE attack framework, which I suppose to validate the efficacy of their SOC or to validate the coverage of their SOC. It's a bit of a challenge because, you know, as I said, it's not really a contextualized assessment. So I'm going to touch a little bit on the case study. So I talked a little bit earlier. So there's a case study and an assessment we did for an organization who had a very competent organization in place. They perhaps wanted to see whether they could get more value for their money or, you know, a better service for the price they're paying, let's say. So before we got involved, they'd whittled it down to 3 vendors, prolific in the industry. And hence we came in and were asked to do a review of the efficacy of these services in the context of the environment to validate how they would react to threats that pertain to that specific organization. So there were 4 areas, A, B, C, D here, that we really looked at when we were planning the approach. So you got A, what does the scope look like? So the challenge with the scope is when we're thinking about scope and we're thinking about deploying these agents to a specific scope group, we can't really roll it out across the board, really, because it's just going to be a massive challenge for the organization. It's not going to be proactive. It's not going to be efficient for them. So we based it on a representative sample of their organization, so through technology and operating system. So let's say, for example, they had 50% Windows endpoints, 20% Mac endpoints, and 30% Linux endpoints. We made sure that it was representable in the context of the environment. We had to make sure that it was comparable, so we had to make sure that the scope didn't change each time that we reviewed a vendor. So vendor A came in, did the assessment in the scope. We had to make sure it was comparable to vendor B. Similarly, we had to make sure that there was not too much variation. We'll get onto a couple of the challenges in a moment with that, but yeah, we just need to make sure it was comparable at the end of the day, and that was one of the real challenges for the scope. What are the control areas we need to validate? So I'll get onto those ones in a little bit in a couple of slides. How do we validate the managed service? So there's a piece on that in a moment as well around efficacy of the managed service and how they responded to threats, etc., in the context of that client's environment. And how do we evaluate and compare? So how do we score? How do we accurately, fairly and concisely score the vendors and give a result? You know, the client wanted to know which one they should choose. We need to make sure that we're given a result that they can use and that's fair and that's concise and that would improve the competency of improve their cyber resilience at the end of the day. So yeah, detection and prevention based on 3 main things. So signature-based, so you know, if it touches disk, is it going to be detected, etc. Very basic signature-based stuff that, you know, vendors should be picking up on, etc. Runtime analysis, so at the time that the binary or the TTP is ran, is the solution picking that up, preventing that, detecting that, what does it look like in telemetry, etc. And then behavioral-based stuff. So, you know, I talk a lot about context, and I'll talk a little bit in a moment about context, but you know, we need to validate that if we're running a PS exec at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday, the vendor who's built their detection solution, detection response solution around the context of the client environment should know that no admin is PS exec at 3 o'clock in the morning. So are they validating that? Are they ensuring that that is a valid user, or are they responding to it in the appropriate manner? detection and prevention, so validation of the managed service. So one of the challenges we had was initial access. So once we'd breached a vendor, once we'd run the initial access TTP, or we'd run a TTP that got us initial access and the vendor saw that, all other TTPs were sort of, unless we switched the infrastructure again, unless, they're sort of known. So we had to make sure that we were fair and concise in that regard. So we validated the vendors initially on the length of time it took for them to respond, how they responded, was the response accurate, and how was the threat isolated, etc. So one of the interesting things about this is that more times than you would like to think, the vendors would respond with inaccurate information. In one actual instance, there was an instance of someone who gave me a totally wrong machine, domain name, everything. It was a child domain of the core domain. And what had actually happened in that scenario was that was an actual incident that was taking place. So we had to really work with the organisation and work with the vendor to ensure, to let them know that wasn't us. That was a real challenge for us, and a real challenge for the vendor. Subsequently, the client chose to continue with the assessment to validate how the vendor would respond to this, etc. It was the incumbent supplier, so they had the solution rolled out enterprise-wide. Additional vendor findings is actually another very interesting one. So there's an anecdote off that as well. So as part of the assessment, we weren't really doing like a vulnerability, like attempting to exploit the sensor or anything like that. But one of the key areas within the cyber kill chain is obviously defense evasion. If I can disable this sensor and blind the managed detection and response team, I'm in for a win. One of the vendors, we attempted similar TTPs to blind the sensors in similar ways across the board to make it comparable, to make it accurate, etc. One of the interesting ones was we were actually able to just turn the sensor off on one of the context of a privileged session, and that subsequently blinded the vendor from the rest of the TTPs that were run on that device, which was very interesting. Subsequently, the vendor's gone away and fixed that, which is really good of them. So we've improved their service as well as ensuring that our client is getting the best value for their investment. So I talked a little bit about the start about attack paths, and last time I was here, well not here, but at the other briefing, I did a presentation on attack paths, and yeah, hopefully instilled some knowledge in people. But I think from the perspective of this, we look to use contextual attack paths to validate the efficacy of these solutions. So I talked a little bit about, a lot about context actually, but one of the things that we started with was when we were having the initial conversations with the client provided us context, provided us a context pack that they would subsequently provide to all three vendors. So this context pack gave us information on the environment, technologies, etc. And I've put a couple of tidbits on the left-hand side there, or the right-hand side for you guys there. But one of the interesting pieces was they let us know that they have a lot of standard level users who have local admin on their devices, which is obviously a big no-no in most cases. But they accepted it was a risk. They had accepted it at that point. It wasn't for us to say you need to remediate this. We were doing a validation of the efficacy of the solution as opposed to fixing vulnerabilities or issues inside their environment. So we drew out a couple of attack paths here, 3 starting nodes attack paths, one from Mac, one from Linux, one from Windows. And you can see on each privilege escalation section on the second node, you can see there is a node for each that pertains to over-permissive accounts or privilege that's excessive. So we ensured that the TTPs we ran against the vendors were contextualized around that known risk. So those guys knew they had local admin on, or lots of users had local admin. We want to ensure that we're running TTPs that look to exploit those and look to see how the vendor responds to such escalation of privilege, let's say. And one thing I will say is that, as I mentioned a moment ago, that we were all provided this information. This wasn't just like, we'll give this to Jumpsec and hope the vendors figure it out. It was a very collaborative piece. And we got halfway through the assessment and they were going, well, they've managed to privilege escalate. And it's like, yeah, well, we gave them local admin on one of the devices because, that was one of our known risks. I'm like, yeah, but you didn't tell us that. It's like, no, we did. This is part of the context pack. He's like, well, we don't know if we can defend that if they've already got local admin. And they're like, okay, right, it's a bit more of a challenge than we thought. But yeah, I suppose I mentioned on runtime analysis as well, which was, we've got users all over the world. So we ran some of these assessments. Like I was logging in at 2 o'clock in the morning in some cases to run some TTPs, validate how the managed detection response team were responding, and subsequently what they were reacting to at 2 o'clock in the morning, whether it was, in the context of that environment, whether it was, anomalous activity, etc., which was really interesting. One thing I did forget to mention on the 3 vendors is that one actually refused to allocate any resource to the managed piece. So they only would allow us to validate the efficacy of the sensor, not the managed detection and response team behind the sensor. Again, I'm not going to name them, but I think that was one of the real challenges. And when we come back to scope, we talk about being comparable. And that's a real challenge when you're trying to compare a full managed detection response POC that's been rolled out to a specific environment and a vendor who's gone, nah, we can't afford to put any man time into this, so we're going to just give you the sensor in your environment and let you log into the SaaS solution and see what we detect. That's a real challenge from a comparison perspective, because you've got active threat hunters who are doing 24/7 threat hunting on an environment, etc., and then you've got a solution that is relying on automatic detection with the premise of perhaps a feature that they want to roll out that gives you some form of overwatch, etc. So, yeah, it was a real challenge. That's one of the challenges. And when we come to scoring and scope scoring, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but making that comparable was really difficult. This was the output, really. So this graph, I'm going to walk you through this table. This is sort of a heat map for detection and response, or prevention and detection. So on the left-hand side, we've got the kill chain. So I spoke a little bit about the cyber kill chain, but there's lots of steps to the cyber kill chain. So we grouped it by kill chain stage. And you'll notice from anybody who's quite familiar with MITRE that there's a massive amount of reconnaissance steps on the MITRE attack framework, much more than what's in this table here. So this is as much a demonstration of prevention and detection as it is us showing you that we didn't just go through MITRE and go, that one, that one, that one, that one, let's see, can we protect this, 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 and this. It was very contextualized around the client's known risks and their environment. Similarly, some of you will notice that there is different technologies. So you've got Macho binary execution at the bottom there, primarily Mac-based TTP. Similarly, some of this stuff like MS Build would be Windows-based TTPs as well. So it wasn't really a group by, there was a lot of technology disparity, but it was grouped by cyber kill chain stage. TTP name down the middle, which I don't need to explain. And on the right-hand side, you've got prevention detection for each vendor, so X, Y, and Z. So what the color of the black means that they didn't prevent or detect, dependent on the respective column. The gray means that we couldn't be ran, so the TTP couldn't be ran. That was due to a variety of different factors. One of the challenges we had was that we did one of these assessments when Print Nightmare was just about literally 3 days after Print Nightmare hit Twitter, hit wherever, the POC dropped. We ran Print Nightmare on one of these vendors. It was picked up straight away. Obviously, it wouldn't be a very fair result if I then did that again for the second vendor who had had all that time to build a signature or build a detection for it. So it was a bit of a challenge. Luckily, what we had was, people will perhaps remember Print Nightmare, Serious Sam they called it, but I think it was Hive Nightmare they ended up with. Both of them came out 3 days before the assessment we did on the respective vendor, which was quite interesting. So it allowed us to validate the efficacy of their solution in regards to how quickly they can detect an exploit that's been released 3 days prior. I was actually really surprised because I pulled the POC, tested it, etc., on a lab environment, ran it on the client environment, and flagged it straight away, isolated the machine, which I was really impressed with because that was 3 days old. So, really good stuff from them. So this was something we put together to, as I said, score. So it's paramount that these guys, that we came out with a score for each vendor and help the client decide which vendor they should choose. So it's based on five key areas. So stage, as I mentioned, stage of the kill chain, likelihood, sophistication, and prevalence. So sophistication, sort of how advanced, prevalence, how accessible, etc. And likelihood, obviously, how likely it was to be used. A bit more on the individual TTPs. So as you see here, you've got the five scoring areas. So you've got stage of execution, sophistication, prevalence, likelihood, complexity. And then there's notes on how each vendor reacted or responded to the relevant TTP. So you can see that, we mentioned that if it was detected or prevented or responded to, etc. We had one instance, I'm going off track again, but we had one instance where we'd extracted the NTDS from the domain controller, and the automatic isolation procedure kicked in and isolated the domain controller, which took the entire network down because they hadn't put that context piece I mentioned again. You can't have that level of you can't have that level of automatic isolation that doesn't vary dependent on criticality of service. You take a domain controller down, you're talking about a complete, depending on redundancy, you're talking about a complete wipeout of network. So I think one of the challenges, and we mentioned it in the report, but one of the challenges with that is obviously we had to stop the entire POC so that the client could bring the network back up, which is a real challenge. Yeah, I think we went through and we validated TTPs based on the context and provided some good feedback. And this is just an extract from one of the TTPs that we ran. So I'm going to a little bit about the assessment observations. So I've mentioned it a lot, and I'm starting to sound like a stuck record, but context is key. One of the things that you might find is that rerunning this assessment in an environment with different contexts perhaps will yield different results, or definitely yield different results. There are common control gaps amongst vendors, so it's quite widely known that EDRs on Unix-based platforms, Linux, etc., are as competent as they are on Windows. So one of the common control gaps, again, specifically amongst the vendors, was that TTP detection and prevention rate on Unix-based operating systems was significantly lower or lesser than that of Windows operating systems and Windows-based devices. So we're seeing it becoming more prevalent amongst threat actors for them to infiltrate an organization, sit inside their Unix environment, SOX proxy the traffic back out to the command and control service, and then use that as a pivot point into the network, because that's based off of the fact that potentially the detection and response for Linux-based systems isn't up to the same quality as it is for Windows-based devices. So I know if I was doing an adversarial simulation piece or emulating a specific threat group, I would potentially try and use that as a vector of initial access and a vector of persistence, let's say. One of the final things, detection and prevention is only half the story. That's interesting. The point I spoke about a moment ago, where the vendor refused to roll out the managed piece, was a real challenge for us, and it sort of looked detrimental on their ability to want to provide an accurate service, I suppose, want for a better word, to be receptive, to be responsive, to be proactive, and it just wasn't there. And in my view, that was something that came up in the report, and we sort of said, look, they refused to roll out this piece of the service. We weren't able to validate it, therefore we can't give any relation to the score and how they would perform in an actual attack. I've put together this interesting coloured table, but you can see on the left-hand side the vendor, the prevention and detection scores based on the TTPs that we ran. So you can see it's based on vendor X is the best vendor in this case, and you can see how it maps against MITRE, which is obviously 100%. It's very interesting because 14% seems very low for detection, but a lot of TTPs, as I say, were run on Linux-based, Mac-based devices, which there was no detection for. We had a situation where I'd entirely compromised. I'd drawn, similar to the attack path that I'd drawn, I'd run an attack path from a compromised Mac device all the way through to compromise a financial system that was in scope, which was a Oracle, horrible technology database that I can't remember the name of, but yeah, compromise of that data without a single detection metric at all. And when you're saying to the client, we're here now, we started here, this is the attack path we followed, there is no detection and prevention controls at each node on this attack path from this vendor. It's quite an eye-opening conversation to have. You're like, oh, well, 40% of our staff use Mac. So if a Mac device is compromised and that macho binary is run and nobody sees it, and they're able to traverse into the Windows environment or the Oracle environment, then that's a real problem for us, because we've got a big amount of Macs, or a sizable amount of Macs that our prevention and detection solution isn't accounting for, or it might be accounting for, but it doesn't have the competency to validate threats that pertain to that operating system or that technology. So it's quite a challenge. It's quite an eye-opening conversation to have with the client. So the key takeaways from today, I've waffled on a lot really, but the market is skewed by MITRE results saying that everybody's 100%. So it's a real challenge for the buyers community when they see that everybody's 100%. I saw this thing going on Twitter when they did the Ingenuity results, that there was a lot of uproar because people were, every vendor, as your market department would, was saying that they scored 100%. And as I showed, that's quite a challenge. But when you actually get into the nitty-gritty of it and roll it out to a contextualized environment that pertains to the environment that you inevitably will roll it out to, the detection and prevention rate is much lower. And that's the metric that you need to take into account. That's the metric that will be important to you, because when a threat actor comes and exploits uses one of those TTPs, and your detection and prevention capability is not there, but it's 100% MITRE because it's skewed, it's going to be a bit of a challenge, and a conversation you perhaps don't want to have. As I mentioned before, receptiveness and responsiveness is key. So I would like to see more of these vendors offering up POCs for their services. So the vendor that didn't roll out the managed service for the scoped environment, I'd like to see a quick change in that mindset. If we can get into a situation whereby the vendors are receptive, they're keen to roll out POCs to environments and have them validated by a third party or have them validated by an organization which uses the context of the organization that the POC is being run in, it's going to make for a much more resilient organization when that POC comes to fruition and they roll it out systemically worldwide, enterprise-wide. And then finally, vendors should be validated on their ability to adapt. Yes, so as I mentioned, the context pack is key. Having that piece, having that known risk of the local admin users or the standard users having local admin rights is paramount to how they build higher fidelity detection controls around that specific known risk. So if you use that if you're drawing attack paths for your organization, and you've got that on your attack path, and you need to ensure that you're building higher fidelity controls, detection controls around that specific node on said attack path. So that's pretty much it for me, I think. Thank you.